Have you ever had the unsettling feeling that your life is moving, but somehow you aren't? Not because you're doing nothing. In fact, your days can feel surprisingly full. You reply to messages. You finish work. You tell yourself you'll spend just 10 minutes on your phone before getting started. Then you glance at the clock, and somehow it's nearly midnight. Nothing dramatic happened. No major mistake. No single bad decision. Just another ordinary day that quietly disappeared. And that's what makes this pattern so difficult to notice. Life rarely falls apart all at once. More often, it slips away in moments too small to question. A conversation you meant to have. An application you almost finished. The idea you were excited about last month but haven't thought about in weeks. Individually, they seem insignificant. Together, they begin shaping the direction of your life. Most people see this and immediately reach the obvious conclusion. I need more discipline. I need better habits. I just need to stop procrastinating. Those explanations sound reasonable. But here's something strange. Have you ever noticed that even after discovering a new productivity system, a better routine, or a burst of motivation, the same pattern quietly finds its way back, almost as if the problem was never the routine in the first place? That raises a much more interesting question. What if this isn't a productivity problem at all? What if the behavior you're trying to fix is actually doing a job? Imagine driving a car with a warning light glowing on the dashboard. You could cover it with a piece of tape. The light would disappear, but the engine wouldn't suddenly become healthy. Our minds often work the same way. The behavior we notice isn't always the real problem. Sometimes it's a signal. Sometimes it's protection. And that's where this becomes unsettling. Because protection sounds like a good, until you ask one simple question. Protection from what? Failure? Embarrassment? Responsibility? Maybe. But none of those answers explain something much stranger. Why would a healthy mind repeatedly guide you toward choices that leave you frustrated at the end of the day? Why would it help you avoid the very future you say you want? Here's a possibility that most people never consider. Maybe your mind isn't trying to ruin your future. Maybe it's trying to protect something that feels even more important than your future. Something so fragile that it would rather let months, or even years, quietly disappear than risk exposing it. Think about that for a moment. The greatest loss in life isn't always failing. Sometimes it's never discovering who you could have become because you spent too long protecting a version of yourself that only existed in your imagination. And if that's true, then procrastination, hesitation, and endless preparation aren't the real story. They read only the footprints of something much deeper. The question is, what exactly has your mind been protecting all this time? If your mind has been protecting something, what could possibly be so important that it's willing to sacrifice months, or even years, to keep it safe? Most people assume the answer is success. It isn't. Success can always be earned later. What's far more fragile is the image you carry of yourself. Not who you are, but who you believe you could become. Think about how often people say, I know I could do it if I really tried. At first, that sounds confident. But hidden inside that sentence is a quiet escape route. Because as long as you never fully commit, no one, not even you, can discover whether that belief is actually true. That's the paradox. Untested potential feels powerful because reality has never been allowed to challenge it. Some psychologists describe this as becoming attached to possibility instead of experience. The name isn't important. The pattern is. Imagine standing in a hallway lined with doors. Each one leads to a different version of your future. As long as you stay in the hallway, every possibility remains alive. But the moment you choose one, reality finally gets a vote. And that's exactly what the mind has been trying to postpone. Here's the contradiction most people never notice. We think avoiding commitment protects our future. In reality, it protects our imagination. The future only exists where decisions are made. Imagination exists everywhere. That's why remaining undecided can feel strangely comforting. You haven't lost anything yet. You also haven't discovered anything. You can watch this happen in surprisingly ordinary moments. You finish writing an important email, then read it 5 more times before closing the draft instead of sending it. You record a video, then delete it because it isn't quite good enough. You almost apply for an opportunity, then convince yourself you'll have a stronger chance next month. None of those moments feel dramatic. They feel sensible, responsible even. But beneath each one is the same hidden bargain. If I never fully test myself, I never have to question who I believe I am. That's why this pattern survives for so long. It doesn't feel like self-sabotage. It feels like self-preservation. And here's the irony. The more carefully you protect your potential, the less opportunity that potential has to become real. Potential is the only place where you can be extraordinary without ever being ordinary first. Read that again in your mind. Because that's the invisible trade so many people make without realizing it. They protect the dream by avoiding the very experiences that could have turned it into reality. The greatest loss isn't missing one opportunity. It's slowly becoming a stranger to the person you might have become because you never allowed reality to introduce the two of you. But this raises an even deeper question. Why would protecting an image of yourself ever feel more important than discovering who you actually are? To answer that, we have to go back to a time when your identity was still being written, long before you ever worried about success, failure, or living up to your own potential. So where does this pattern begin? Not with your first job, not with adulthood, and not with procrastination. It usually begins much earlier. The first time you started wondering what made you enough. Think back for a moment. As a child, you were constantly receiving small messages about yourself. Sometimes they came as praise. You're so smart. You're a natural. You're the responsible one. Other times they arrived more quietly. You noticed people smiled a little more when you succeeded. You noticed mistakes felt heavier than effort. Without anyone planning it, you slowly learned something that many people carry for the rest of their lives. Who I am depends on how well I perform. That belief doesn't feel dangerous. In fact, it can make you work harder. Until one day, it quietly changes the game. Instead of asking, how do I grow? You begin asking a different question without even realizing it. How do I avoid looking incapable? That single shift changes almost everything. Have you ever had an idea in a meeting, known exactly what you wanted to say, then stayed silent because you couldn't phrase it perfectly? Or typed out a message, read it 3 times, then deleted the whole thing? Not because it was wrong, because it might not sound as good as you wanted. Those moments seem unrelated. They're not. They're tiny additions. Not for other people, for your own identity. Here's the strange contradiction. The more important it becomes to see yourself as capable, the less willing you become to do the very things that build capability. Because real growth has an awkward stage. It asks you to ask beginner questions, to make ordinary mistakes, to produce work that isn't impressive yet. And if your identity has become attached to always looking competent, those moments don't feel educational. They feel threatening. That's why some people spend years preparing for challenges they were already capable of beginning. Not because they need more knowledge. Because knowledge isn't what's at risk. Identity is. Then reality introduces a rule that no childhood ever prepares us for. Life doesn't reward the person with the most potential. It responds to the person who is willing to be seen learning. That's an uncomfortable trade. Because every meaningful step forward forces you to exchange certainty for feedback. And feedback is dangerous to an identity that has spent years trying to look complete. Which leads to one of the strangest behaviors in human psychology. People often think they're avoiding failure. They're not. They're avoiding information. Information that might reveal they're less skilled than they hoped. Or perhaps far more capable than they ever believed. Either answer changes the story they've been telling themselves. So the mind chooses a third option. It delays the test. Because as long as reality never gets an answer, though identity remains untouched. And that's the hidden trap. The version of yourself you're trying so carefully to protect slowly becomes the very thing preventing you from discovering who you really are. But once the mind decides that protecting identity is more important than gathering evidence, it doesn't stop there. It invents subtle, believable ways to keep that identity safe every single day. And that's exactly where the next layer of the story begins. By this point, you might expect your mind to protect your identity in obvious ways. By making you afraid, or filling your head with doubt. But that's rarely how it works. The mind is much more persuasive than that. It doesn't usually tell you a lie. It tells you something that feels almost true. And that's exactly why it's so difficult to notice. Take this simple question. Have you ever finished a day feeling strangely exhausted, even though the one thing that really mattered never got done? It's a strange experience. You weren't being lazy. You answered messages, cleared your inbox, organized your notes, watched one more video because it might contain the missing piece. By evening, you felt busy, but oddly unchanged. The relief was real. The progress wasn't. Your mind had found a way to reduce the anxiety of action without asking you to face action itself. That's the first illusion. Not the illusion of productivity. The illusion of emotional relief. For a few hours, postponing the challenge feels almost as satisfying as facing it. Now notice something completely different. Imagine someone asks whether you've decided to apply for that opportunity, or start the project you've been talking about. Your answer sounds reasonable. I'm still thinking about it. I'm weighing my options. I don't want to rush such an important decision. There's nothing obviously wrong with any of those sentences. Until weeks quietly become months. Here's the surprising part. Sometimes we don't keep every option open because we love freedom. We keep every option open because choosing one future means allowing every other imagined future to disappear. The decision isn't painful because of what you choose. It's painful because of what you must let go of. And the mind would often rather protect unlimited possibilities than experience one imperfect reality. But there's one pattern that's even harder to recognize. Imagine two people facing the exact same obstacle. Both lose an opportunity. Both experience rejection. Both have genuine reasons to feel discouraged. One of them asks, given what's happened, what's still possible? The other quietly begins asking, maybe this is just who I am. From the outside, those thoughts look similar. Psychologically, they're worlds apart. One person treats circumstances as information. The other turns circumstances into identity. And once that happens, something almost invisible takes place. Every disappointment becomes another piece of evidence supporting the same story. Not, this was difficult, but this is me. That's the most convincing illusion of all. Because once your identity attaches itself to the obstacle, remaining stuck starts feeling strangely logical. You no longer need to protect your potential. You only need to keep proving the story you've already accepted. Think about that. Most people believe they're trapped by their circumstances. Sometimes they're trapped by the explanation they've repeated about those circumstances for so long that it no longer feels like a thought. It feels like reality. And that's why these patterns are so difficult to escape. They were never random habits. They were never simply procrastination. They were all serving the same invisible purpose. Protecting a story about who you believe you are. But that raises one final question. If your identity has been quietly shaping your decisions all this time, what gives that identity so much power in the first place? The answer isn't motivation. It isn't discipline. It's something much deeper. Something that changes the relationship you have with yourself every single day. By now, the pattern is probably starting to look different. What you've been calling procrastination, what you've been blaming on motivation, what you've been trying to fix with discipline, may have been something else entirely. A damaged relationship. Not with your career. Not with success. With yourself. Here's a question most people never think to ask. If someone else made promises to you as often as you make promises to yourself, would you trust them? I'll definitely start on Monday. I'll share my work next time. Tonight, I'll finally have that difficult conversation. This is the last time I'll back out. None of those promises feel dramatic. Most of them are forgotten within days. Your brain doesn't forget them. Every kept promise becomes evidence. Every abandoned promise becomes evidence too. And your mind is always asking the same quiet question. When this person says they're going to do something, should I believe them? That question changes everything. Because what many people call a confidence problem is often something much deeper. It's a trust problem. Think about the strange feeling that appears when an opportunity finally arrives. The interview you've wanted. The chance to present your idea. The moment to finally publish something you've spent months perfecting. Part of you gets excited. Another part whispers, you'll probably back out anyway. That voice doesn't always come from fear. Sometimes it comes from history. Your own history. The evidence your mind has collected over months or years. And here's the remarkable part. Your brain isn't trying to punish you. It's trying to make accurate predictions. If someone repeatedly disappears after making promises, you naturally stop expecting them to show up. Your mind learns from you in exactly the same way. That's why trust matters more than motivation. Motivation rises and falls with mood. Trust survives moods. Trust says, I don't know how I'll feel tomorrow, but I've seen enough evidence to believe I'll still do what I said I'd do. Notice how different that is from trying to feel confident. Confidence often asks, can I succeed? Trust asks, can I count on myself once I begin? Those are completely different questions, and one of them is far more powerful. Because every time you quietly keep a promise that no one else even knows about, you're doing far more than completing a task. You're rewriting your identity. Imagine sketching in a notebook with a pencil. One line barely changes the page, but thousands of small strokes eventually reveal an entirely different picture. Identity works the same way. It isn't rewritten by one life-changing decision. It's redrawn through ordinary moments that seem too small to matter. You finally press publish instead of saving another draft. You return the difficult phone call you've been avoiding all week. You finish the last 10% of a project that nobody else would have noticed if you abandoned it. Those moments don't just change your schedule. They change the evidence your mind collects about who you are. And slowly, almost quietly, something begins to shift. You stop borrowing confidence from motivation. You start building it from memory, from repeated proof that your own words carry weight. Because in the end, The strongest form of confidence isn't believing you're extraordinary. It's knowing that when you give yourself your word, you no longer have a reason to doubt it. And once that relationship begins to heal, something remarkable becomes possible. You don't need a completely new personality. You don't need perfect discipline. You only need to start giving your mind new evidence. Because that's how the waiting room finally begins to disappear. So how do you finally leave this invisible waiting room? The answer appears much earlier than most people expect. Not after you feel ready. Not after you become fearless. The turning point begins the moment you stop waiting for certainty to arrive before you act. Because readiness isn't usually what creates action. More often, action quietly creates readiness. That sounds simple. But psychologically, it's a complete reversal of how many people have been living. If you followed everything we've explored so far, you've probably noticed something. Your mind was never trying to predict your future. It was trying to predict what was most likely to happen based on your past. That's how the brain works. It builds expectations from evidence. If yesterday ended with another promise postponed, your mind naturally expects today to end the same way. Not because it's against you, because prediction is one of its most important jobs, which means something remarkable follows. Every action you take isn't only changing your circumstances, it's updating your brain's prediction of who you are. That's why the first step doesn't need to be dramatic. In fact, dramatic change often fails because it asks your mind to believe a story it has no evidence for. Real change usually begins much smaller. Not because small actions are magically powerful, but because they're believable. One completed promise carries more psychological weight than 100 imagined ones. Think about what we've uncovered. You weren't waiting because you were lazy. You weren't even waiting because you lacked discipline. You were waiting because waiting allowed an old identity to survive another day without being questioned. And that's the hidden cost of endless preparation. It doesn't simply delay your progress. It quietly freezes your identity in yesterday's version of yourself. Here's something most people never realize. Every future you refuse to choose feels preserved. But it isn't. While you're trying to keep every possibility alive, time is making choices for you anyway. The career you never explored. The conversation you never had. The person you never became. Those possibilities don't remain untouched. They slowly become unavailable. Not through one dramatic decision, but through thousands of ordinary days that seem too insignificant to matter. That's why the real opposite of procrastination isn't productivity. It's participation. Stepping into reality before you have complete certainty. Allowing reality to answer questions that imagination never can. Because imagination can only create stories. Reality creates evidence. And evidence is what reshapes identity. Maybe that's the biggest misunderstanding of all. People spend years trying to think their way into becoming someone new. But the brain rarely believes thoughts by themselves. It believes patterns. It believes repeated evidence. It believes the life you've actually lived far more than the speeches you've given yourself in your head. So perhaps this entire journey was never really about becoming a different person. It was about giving your mind permission to stop defending an outdated story. Because the person you're trying to become has never been trapped behind a lack of motivation. They've been waiting for enough evidence to exist. And every honest action you take gives them a little more. Which brings us back to where we began. That invisible waiting room was never a physical place. It was a prediction. A story your mind kept replaying because, for a long time, the evidence never changed. But predictions are not permanent. The moment the evidence changes, the prediction begins to change with it. And perhaps that's the most hopeful truth in all of psychology. You don't have to win an argument with your mind. You only have to give it a new story that reality can prove.